My name is Hemakantha Medampali,
My name's Connor Woodward.
and today we're going to be looking into what it means to be Black in Cuba. First, we are going to share a brief overview of Black history in Cuba and what our particular focus will be. For
Yeah.
a brief overview, there is a long and complex history to the presence of Afro-descended people in Cuba. Following the Haitian Revolution in 1790, Cuba rushed to fill the French's role in the sugar industry. So nearly 800,000 enslaved Africans were imported to support the booming sugar industry. Propelling Cuba forward economically, slavery persisted until 1886, when it was officially abolished. This makes Cuba one of the last countries to abolish slavery in the Western Hemisphere, which shows how deep-rooted oppression is in their history. Even after the abolition of slavery, Afro-Cubans were not recognized as citizens for over a decade, and even then they faced political suppression and discrimination to this day. According to the 2012 Cuban census, there are 1 million Cubans who self-identified as Black and 3 million who self-identified as mulatto or mestizo, so mixed race, which makes approximately 37% of the population of Black descent. But how accurate is this number? The Cuban government has been historically known to limit race-related data as well as underrepresent non-white populations. We will explain more on why this is later in the video, but it's important to note the bias in these statistics. Estimates of the true Afro-Cuban population range from 30 to 60%. Our overarching topic is anti-Blackness in post-revolutionary Cuba. When Fidel Castro took over after the 1959 revolution, there was a public declaration that racism had been eliminated. However, the reality was public racial discourse became prohibited, silencing any critique or assessment of the nation's deep-rooted anti-Blackness. So we're using this project as an opportunity to explore what racism looks like in a post-revolutionary Cuba and the lasting impacts of Fidel Castro's leadership on the nation's racial dynamics. A brief timeline of what happened post-revolution. We can start in 1959 when Castro's revolution began. We will get more into this later, but he launched anti-discrimination campaigns while simultaneously taking actions behind the scenes to silence Black voices. Then in 1961, Castro actually declared racism eliminated, but his administration was pushing a policy of raceless nationalism. Then in the 2000s, we start to see more scholars challenging the lack of racial discourse in Cuba, like Madrazo, for example. Then moving into the 2020s, we see a lot more Afro-Cuban protests in the face of police brutality and immense poverty in Black communities. We're going to break this topic down into three sections. The first being the public's misconceptions, the second being the reality of the lived experiences of Afro-Cubans under Castro's rule, and finally the long-lasting racial consequences of Castro's regime.
The biggest misconception is that the revolution fixed racism. In the 1960s, Castro declared that all racial discrimination had been eliminated. Like many scholars, like Benson in 2012, argue that this was a political move to gain favor, not a genuine effort. Adding on to this notion that racism had been fixed, it is widely misconceived that Afro-Cubans are treated equally to white Cubans. Structural and systemic racism persist, for example, as explained by Ferrin Castellanos and De La Fuente in 2021. Ferrin Castellanos and De La Fuente show the expanding private sector is still deeply racially stratified and is being hidden by public sector data sets. Another misconception is that it's just Cuba that has to deal with this. You can see in many other Latin American countries that they had similar topics, but in different names. So both Cuba and Brazil, for example, promoted the idea of racial democracy, which is the notion that racial mixing eliminated racism. The truth about that in Brazil, it's called democracia racial, and in Cuba, they just refer to it as raceless nationalism. Both were used to suppress Black political organizing while structural inequality persisted, not actually to eliminate racism. Castro was, when he took power, was very big on trying to get everybody to support him, especially Afro-Cubans. So in the face of the public, he publicly desegregated schools, beaches, and workplaces and declared racial discrimination as counter-revolutionary. And this was to garner as much support from Afro-Cubans as he could, given that they were just enslaved and segregated against. Now they finally have someone who's speaking for their problems. However, he was not speaking the truth. In the background of all of this, he was actually shutting down long-standing Afro-Cuban mutual aid societies and advocacy clubs because he considered them to be unnecessary. And further along, he eventually he made it so that speaking out against racial discrimination was divisive and disloyal to his revolution. So Black Cubans could no longer speak out against the discrimination they were experiencing. They were just expected to be quiet and be grateful for Castro. This had pretty big cause and effect on, Cuba. So first, Castro recruited as many Afro-Cubans as he could. Now he had as many people backing him. And then in the background, he would begin suppressing independent Black organizations because he labeled them counter-revolutionary. That led into what we now know as raceless nationalism, and where Castro coined the phrase "not Black, not white, only Cuban," which made claiming racial identity politically dangerous because you were now going against what Castro was saying, and he was the one in power. Now, the final effect of racist nationalism is that the inequality from pre-segregation, from pre-revolution, is still preserved. Without race-conscious policies, white Cubans remained rich and remained powerful. They remained in those positions of power that they were.
In his 2016 novel Anti-Racism in Cuba, Devin Spence Benson details the hypocrisy between the lived experience of Afro-Cubans and Castro's public image. For example, as Castro was running programs to promote racial equity and integration among schools, his campaign was using incredibly racist imagery to back the revolution. To the right is an image of a military officer of the opposing side who was of mixed race, and he led a largely mixed race group. As you can see, while they are allegedly fighting prejudice, they're using caricatures to support their movement.
So there's cultural and systemic consequences to what Castro did to Cuba and this raceless nationalism that they instilled. For cultural, we see that, a race Afro-Cuban culture like Black clubs and organizations, led to less racial pride. So we had a whole generation of Afro-Cubans who grew up thinking that that calling out racism was shameful, that they should be ashamed of their own race, that's only because of Castro being in power. We look further to systemic consequences. We see that the white Cubans who were previously in power and abusing the Afro-Cubans retained this power. They retained the same houses, the same wealth, and later on, Castro creates the Cuba's private sector, which just created a larger economic inequality between the white Cubans who had something to build off of, had wealth to build off of, and the Afro-Cubans who had nothing and had to start from nothing. There are other cultural consequences and things that we've seen, such as pelo malo and pelo bueno. So that was colorist language that was part of Cuban households that are just only used to judge Black and Afrocentric features as bad, like kinky hair is bad, and then Eurocentric features, those long straight hair, is good, which is teaching their children to devalue Blackness from birth. Furthermore, there's skin tone social hierarchies. So social hierarchies persist in daily life, where we'll see that lighter-skinned Afro-Cubans had reported being treated more favorably in social settings, workplaces, and by the police. Blanqueamiento is Obregon in 2021 defined this as the cultural pressure to whiten one's family through interracial relationships. So this is rooted in colonial belief that African features needed to be bred out. This is that people in Cuba believed that you had to just get out, you had to be bred with white Cubans so that you were no longer showing your African features. And further, like we see this, more clearly is that a lot of the culture of Afro-Cubans has been erased. We see that music genres like son, rumba, and conga are all rooted in African traditions, and it was brought over to Cuba by the enslaved Africans. Yet Cuban national identity has celebrated these art forms for decades, centuries, and they've erased their Black origin. They claim it as simply their own, and that they don't appreciate how it came from the African enslaved people. Structural consequences and systemic consequences. We see that there's buena presencia, and that's where Cuban tourism and service jobs in that private sector, they'll use coded language where they'll say presencia, which means good appearance. This is used to discriminate against Afro-Cubans and their skin color. So they would look at you and say, "Oh, well, you're not, you're a white Cuban. So buena presencia, that's to say like you're okay, we like you." And so it excluded them from the private sector and the tourism sector, which was it is the most lucrative sector of Cuba's economy. So it's even further, they're keeping the Afro-Cubans, in poverty. And we see there's an income gap as well. So nominal data shows equality in state salaries, but if you look further, which is not reported as often, that the expanding private economy created like very deep, large racial wealth gaps. So Afro-Cubans make up the majority of Cuba's extremely poor. According to DN, in 2011, a system only maintained by Castro's communist ideals. So only Castro, like this system is created by Castro to keep these Afro-Cubans down in poverty, and so then they can't do anything. There's housing inequalities as well, where the Afro-Cubans are disproportionately concentrated in Cuba's most deteriorated housing stock, which is just a legacy of segregation that was never fixed, never corrected. We see that these white Cubans, they stayed in their wealthy homes and their nice homes, and then they left all of the Afro-Cubans to be concentrated in these deteriorating houses. And then we see in 2020s the protests where Afro-Cubans were finally protesting against Castro's regime and the discrimination they face. And they were met with harsh police enforcement during the protests, with race inequality documenting disproportionate arrests, detention times, and brutality from police. So this looking into all of this stuff really helped us both just figure out like, wow, this is happening in the world. I'm Puerto Rican, so I grew up in Puerto Rico, where there's similar things, be it by different names, but there's a lot of African culture that has shaped what Puerto Rico is, and there are a lot of people in Puerto Rico who really like they try and discriminate. So it was really eye-opening to see like how Cuba has it and Cuba has it worse.
Sorry, to add on to what he said, additionally, looking into the history of racism in a country that heavily filters conversation around race and restricts discourse, it gave us new perspective on research and learning to represent different perspectives, especially when voices are being silenced. It also helped us deepen our social awareness because understanding how deep-rooted racial injustices can be in a country really reinforces the importance of addressing racial prejudice and violence in our communities. And in conclusion, the history of Afro-descended people in Cuba reveals a profound disconnect between revolutionary rhetoric and the lived reality of Afro-Cubans. From the late abolition of slavery to Fidel Castro's declaration of a raceless society while actively working against Afro-Cuban communities, the Cuban state has systemically suppressed authentic racial discourse under the guise of national unity and nationalism. This not only silenced Black voices and did not eliminate anti-Blackness, but instead it drove systemic racism, and it created severe economic disparities and private sector stratification and biased census data and state propaganda, all which work together to continue the regime's historic hypocrisy that continues to impact Afro-Cubans today. Ultimately, our research shows that true racial equity cannot be achieved by historical erasure. For Cuba to move forward, it must first confront its deep-rooted legacy of white supremacy and allow Afro-Cubans the freedom to voice, analyze, and dismantle the systemic barriers that they continue to face today. Here are our citations.